topic of this video was really put in my mind by a brief conversation I had with another university professor here in Dahong, China. She had a family emergency. It seemed that a younger relative of hers had suddenly died or was dying, and she had to go to the hospital. So she was asking me at the last minute to teach some classes for her. And I immediately, without question, said, yeah, okay, great. Let's, tell me the time, tell me where to go. And I was preparing to go and do it. Now, she ended up canceling with apologies. She got an update from the hospital. Turned out this relative of hers, although apparently badly injured, is not going to die. So she's going to go and visit the person in the next few days instead. So good news, of course. And I wrote back to her in Chinese saying, in effect, all teachers are brothers. I just said in Chinese something to the effect that there's a common kinship between all teachers. And it was a nice thing to say at the time, of course. It was quite appropriate because I was saying, look, if you need my help, I'm happy to help you again. But of course, it's also sad for me to just pause and reflect on that, staring into my mobile phone, because it's not true. It's not true in Western culture, and it's not true in my experience here in Asian culture. There's very little kinship. There's very little cooperation between intellectuals of any kind, between people who work in education of any kind. And it's really sad because the truth is that any given field of studies, any given mandate, any given mission, any given movement, like a political movement, like the vegan movement, what have you, you really rely on cooperation of exactly that kind. You rely on a lot of generosity of spirit, and without it, the field can't progress. I can say specifically in education is unlike other sectors in that you absolutely have to show generosity toward people who don't deserve it. You can't just show generosity towards the students that show the most potential or towards your colleagues who show the most potential. You have to take the time and make the effort to reach out to and encourage all kinds of people who don't have any potential or who seem not to have any potential. You have to make the effort to help people advance in the field of studies again and again, only to later be disappointed, only to find out that they're going nowhere, that they have no potential at all, that they have none of the talents necessary, or what have you. And I think it's a discipline. I think that's really part of the role of the educator, is to do that again and again, to be disappointed again and again, and not to let that disappointment cloud your judgment, not to become bitter, not to become shut down, not to close the door against a whole future generation of scholars in your field because of the disappointments you've had in the past, whether those disappointments are a dozen or 24 or 200, no matter how many times you've been disappointed by the people in the field you've been trying to help out. There was one woman, I guess she's still alive, but she's now very, very elderly. Very, very elderly scholar called Jacqueline Filiozet. And when I met her, it was really just too late. She had so many times had people approach her who said ostensibly that they wanted to develop expertise in her field. She really works specifically on handwritten Pali manuscripts. So we say palm leaf manuscripts. Pali is the most ancient language of Buddhist philosophical tradition. These actual manuscripts are normally just from the last few hundred years, but they're part of that literary tradition. And, so when I was talking to her, I wasn't the first person to say that. I was the last. But the truth was, even from the first conversation I had with her, in terms of where I'd been living, what I'd been doing, and what I could show her on paper of my own work, it was very clear I didn't just have potential. I wasn't merely a theoretical talent. What I had was actual. I really had what it took to be a significant person in that field. Now that field, in her generation, she's one of 5 people or something, maybe even less. Really, for her generation, she might be the only one, the only specialist in that field, the only legitimate specialist, at least the only one who speaks a European language, Because sure, there will be a few experts in Myanmar who don't speak any English. Are there a few experts in Sri Lanka? maybe. Just to mention briefly, so I was a scholar of Pali, of Theravada Buddhism, and Theravada Buddhism has the misfortune of not being supported by any wealthy Western countries and not by any wealthy countries within Asia. So the situation for scholarship of Japanese Buddhism is very, very different from what the situation has been in Sri Lanka or in Myanmar in the last few decades, because those have been countries that haven't just been struggling with poverty, they've also been struggling with civil war. With all that having been said, when I met Philiosat, she was not too old to help me. She wasn't. It was perfect timing. And I actually moved to Cambodia specifically so that I could learn from her, so I could work with her, so I could sit down in an archives, in a manuscriptorium, and do the hard work by hand and eye of studying those kinds of manuscripts with her. And it never happened. It wasn't too late. It would have been a perfect time for the passing of the torch. She had just retired, and she was allegedly at the time, she said she was going to retire to Cambodia, from France to Cambodia. And she could have passed on the accumulated wisdom of her decades of research and just hands-on experience working with that type of Buddhist manuscript. And I really was the right guy to receive it. It's not worth describing the background I had at that point. But it was too late in another sense, because she had already had her heart broken too many times. Now, Philiosat had some other strategic disadvantages. For example, she was crazy. But she had been through some situations I can sympathize with, where, for example, at one point she signed up with some official government of Thailand funded program that provided her with a few students, but these students who were paid to be there by the taxpayers of Thailand, they didn't really want to be there. It's not what they were about. And she described that whole experience to me, and then afterwards she said these students all sent her invitations to their weddings and things like that. They tried to stay in touch in a polite way. None of these people had any interest or any aspiration in ever becoming scholars of Buddhism, much less did they have an interest in doing the exceptionally hard work of working on handwritten manuscripts and, stone carvings, texts that are etched into stone, or carved into stone, whatever you want to say, chiseled into stone. I'm lacking for verbs at the moment. That kind of, archive-based research is an even more rare specialization within the broader field. So, she had been disappointed with one wave of students after another who had been recruited through crummy government programs, or in some cases through library studies programs, people who were getting a diploma in library science, this kind of thing. Yeah, well, they ain't me. I really was the right person to become her student, and I was deprived of the opportunity because she had her heart broken too many times before I ever got there. And Philiosat, the last thing I ever got from her, she sent a sweater to my newborn baby daughter. Thanks for the sweater, Philiosat. But what I needed from you really was not a fucking hand-knitted sweater for my daughter. My daughter had plenty of sweaters. What I really needed for you to do was sit down at a table with me and show that you have a sincere concern about the future of that area of studies. I needed you to sit down with me and help me take nothing and come up with something. I need you to advise me on how I could have a future in that area of studies, and thus that area of studies would have really benefited from having one more person like me in it. Because when you get into these obscure fields, Pali, Cree, Ojibwe, and right now I'm going to talk about Dahong Dai, each and every intellectual in that field is crucial, makes a big positive difference, or makes a big negative difference, And Pali is only unusual. It's only unlike the others that I'm mentioning in this video, in that in Pali you get a lot of fraud. You get a lot of people pretending to be experts who aren't. But for the most part, all those fields, it's a long, hard road of developing meaningful expertise and putting your mind and heart into trying to do something positive with the expertise you've got. But this small number of people, whether they are university professors or independent scholars, whatever their road they walk in life, it's crucial that they show that kind of generosity toward people who don't deserve it. because they may not be able to discern the very few who do deserve it, the very few who can take that advice, even if it's just a few emails bouncing back and forth, who can take that advice and really make something happen, right? And if they don't, that field of studies will collapse. And, I just want to say, I had that experience. I was involved with Pali for so many years. I took the time. I reached out to and replied to a lot of other aspiring students of Pali, and I gave them exactly the advice they needed, whether it was about university programs or just about the books, which books they need to work with, which is a very hard question to answer for Pali. Just mentioned where they should go and how they should proceed. I provided a lot of advice and a lot of time counseling younger scholars in the field when I was getting up towards having 10 years of experience myself. And if you don't, then the field will collapse. The field of study will fail, apart from the devastating impacts it may have on the individual scholar. So I went through a surreal situation at University of Victoria where there was one professor there whom I talked to at length. And again, I'm reminded of some remarks from a female rapper, who said that she, after a certain point in her life, as she got older as a woman, she was no longer interested in dating men who had potential. She was only interested in men who could prove that they had potential. She was only interested in something actual, not something potential, if you want to say it that way. With all these professors, I was able to show I don't just have potential, I have something actual. My potential is proven, is demonstrated. There was a professor at University of Victoria, and he did Buddhism, Buddhist studies, and he did Sanskrit in particular. Sanskrit's a language very similar to Pali. And I had written to him emails over many years, over several years, trying to get something positive going, as I'd written to professors of Buddhism from coast to coast in Canada, from the East Coast to the West Coast, including tiny, tiny universities like University of Lethbridge. Ridiculous. I talked to everybody. And I couldn't find an opportunity anywhere to work my way towards a master's degree, which is ultimately one of the most important reasons why I had to cease to be a scholar of Buddhism. It was devastating for me. It's devastating for me, and I'm not boasting to say, ultimately, it is really pretty devastating for the field. It's a small field, and it is lacking for brilliance. I made a huge impact in that field during my years just as an outsider and as a student. And there's no doubt in my mind what kind of impact I could have had positively if any of these people lifted a finger to make it possible for me to stay in the field. But they didn't. Anyway, this guy, he saw my peer-reviewed articles. He saw other essays, other evidence of my work on languages. And again, I didn't just do languages. Languages, history, politics, anthropology, field work, visiting the Buddhist temples, living there in that situation, really, really deep, meaningful engagement with the subject matter. I could demonstrate going back over many years. And this guy, he wasn't insulting to me. He wasn't an ass to me or anything. But he just didn't care. He just did not lift a finger to make anything positive happen. And among the evidence that he recognized that was a talent, he asked me to peer review an article for a journal he was formerly involved in. So I actually peer reviewed an article for him. He said, "Hey, look, I'm part of this journal. Can you peer review this?" He said this is more in my area of expertise than it is in his, which was true. And I did. I did a good peer review for him. I did a detailed discussion of what was wrong with that article. Okay? But then he could not be bothered to answer email from me when I'm offering at my really advanced level. I'm in my late 30s. I'm way more advanced than any 18-year-old student in a BA program. I'm way more advanced than a 21-year-old student applying to go into a master's program. And I'm writing to him saying, look, this is who I am. This is my background. I'm looking for any MA options long-term, and I'm willing to do a second BA, which is extraordinary. Very, very few people go back to get second BA. And I wasn't just willing in the abstract. I actually did that twice. I enrolled in a new BA twice in Canada, and that reflects just how terrible the Canadian education system is. And I'm getting that second BA now. I'm getting it in Asian studies. Not in Buddhist studies, not anything to do with Buddhism. That whole part of my career is now over. Anyway, I finally met this guy in unique and memorable circumstances. I went to see him, and he was trying to teach a course on Sanskrit. I signed up for this course on the computer with no intention of actually taking the course. I thought I would just show up, sit in the back of the classroom, listen to the guy talk for 1 hour. I thought there'd be 40 other students. I thought it would be a normal university classroom, and then I'd walk out. I thought I'd just go and see what this class was. It was supposed to be Sanskrit for Buddhism. It was like Buddhist textual Sanskrit. I show up, sit there alone. I end up running back and forth to the department office. I say, this must be the wrong room. Nobody's there. Not one other student. Not one professor. Professor eventually shows up 15 minutes late. I'm literally the only student in the room. He never reached out to me, and he never reached out to anybody. And yes, that's devastating for me. The decisions he made had a devastating impact on me, personally, professionally, educationally. I needed one professor somewhere in Canada to just be willing to talk to me through email for the rest of my career to be possible, and not even one would do it, and it could have been him. So yeah, it was devastating for me, but guess what? It's devastating for him also. Because the reality of the thing is, he wanted to teach Sanskrit, and he didn't make any effort to cultivate talent, to attract new talent to his program. And so he didn't have any talent. All right? Sanskrit is not like dentistry. People want to make money everywhere. So if you put up a sign saying you're going to give people diplomas in dentistry, some people are going to show up, right? Studying Sanskrit, studying Pali, studying Buddhism, even Asian studies, even politics of Asia, because a lot of what I do is political, always has been. Nobody's making any money out of that. You've got to reach out and cultivate talent, for the good of your own career, for the good of that individual's career, but for the good of the field as a whole, for the future of the field is crucial, right? And he never did that. So he had an empty classroom. And instead of me sitting there and listening to him do a lecture about what the course is going to be, it's what I was expecting. It's the first day of this course. Instead, he and I sat down and had a face-to-face. And I had to say to him, I think it was unexpected from, hey, I'm that guy. I was writing to you for years because I used to be a real scholar of Buddhism. I used to live in Laos and Cambodia and Sri Lanka. I did all this research. I did all that, I'm that guy who wrote those articles. I'm that guy who you asked me to peer review an article for you. But when I was writing to you, you couldn't even be bothered to reply. When I was writing to you, when I was offering to become your student, you couldn't lift a finger. So my career is over because nobody opened a door for me. Every single door was slammed in my face. So my career had to end. And you were one small but crucial part of that story. So we had that conversation. I don't know what he got out of it. And I don't get the sense that he was intimidated by me. Some professors are. Some professors are not used to having applicants. They're only used to having supplicants. They're only used to having 18-year-olds who ask questions and who can't answer them. Some professors are deeply unsettled by having a student who's at a more confident, advanced level. But that's not my impression of this guy. My impression of this guy is simply indolence. He just didn't care. He just doesn't see himself as having any ambition to make something happen for himself, for his students, or for the field. And that indolence, in the end, it destroys the field of study. It destroys the lives of individual would-be scholars, would-be students, what have you. And it destroys the whole field. And really, that's what happened with Pali, with Theravada Buddhist studies, on a pretty big scale worldwide in the last several years. So I'm making this video now. As I mentioned, I just had this interesting conversation with another professor where I immediately offered to help her out when she had a relative in the hospital. I also just posted this job, and I've been offering to help some complete stranger get this job in a university here, just out of the goodness of my heart, just as a mitzvah. And I know how rare that is too. People don't seem to do much to help other people these days. It's sad. It's a big difference between Western culture and Chinese culture, the culture of Guanxi and so on and so forth. And I had another conversation, I don't think I have to read it aloud here, about the possibility of becoming a scholar of Dahong Dai. Now look, guys, I don't want to bore you by talking about all the languages I've studied. Before, when I was saying this professor of Sanskrit, and professor of Buddhism, but Sanskrit via Buddhism and Buddhism via Sanskrit, he should have recognized me as a talent because I already did all this work on Pali. Well, I'm talking to another professor lately, and for him, the fact that I worked on Pali is important, but it's also important that I worked on northern Lao. I lived in Laos for so many years, speaking the Lao language and specifically the northern dialects, because I was talking to one of the only white men in the world who has a background in Dahong Dai, in the indigenous language here. Sorry if it sounds racist to say one of the only white men. I mean, he's someone who speaks English as his first language. He has a PhD. He's a professor. He's in a position to really determine the future of that whole field of studies. Of course, there may be other people with expertise who, have none of those things going for them, who can't communicate with you in English, who don't have an institutional position, who don't have a PhD, and so on. If you meet a kindly little old man in a village who could help you with this area of scholarship, but he's maybe a farmer, anthropologists often have to work very hard to make an educational arrangement out of that kind of scenario. But a very, very small number of people will actually have salaried positions as professors and will have PhDs and will speak English in a field like this. Whenever you get into anything like this, Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, Pali, Dahong Dai, I've looked at so many fields where the whole fate of the field rests with a small number of hardworking intellectuals. And otherwise, maybe there are a few Christian missionaries, and that's a wrap. And ultimately, the future of whether or not these languages survive, the future of these indigenous peoples and their cultures, the future of the literature and philosophy itself, so much hangs on a small number of intellectuals having the generosity and the discipline to reach out to and help one another for the future of that field of study. Anyway, I wrote to this guy saying, and he's, as you can figure out who he is, he's the only, I think in this generation, he is literally the only English-speaking man who studied Dahong Dai, this language from this area. I said to him, I am literally one of only 3 white men living in Dahong long term. No, I really wasn't expecting much of an effort on your part, but I was expecting you to make more of an effort than you have. The indolence of people like yourself has long-term consequences for both scholarship in the abstract and for the lives of scholars in particular. So pause. I should say, this guy has met me in person. This is not about talking to some 18-year-old student whose potential is highly hypothetical. Okay? He's met me. I've actually handed him copies of my publications on paper. He's seen me eye to eye in person. He's spoken to me for several hours. He's heard me tell anecdotes about my research as well as actually seeing my research. He's seen evidence of the kind of self-discipline and focus I can have in doing language research. He should know me enough to trust me to a real extent. And again, in my case, we're not just talking about potential. We're talking about something actual. And I've got the demonstrated capacity to make the kind of discipline, self-sacrifice needed to contribute to a field like this. So he should know. And I'd written to him now for several months saying, hey, I'm moving to your area of study. And I have the background in terms of language, history, politics. So much scholarship I've done. I really have the background to take advantage of living in Dahong to really work on this language and make a contribution to your field of study. But what it takes is somebody with a PhD to at least advise me, to at least answer my emails, to open up a door for me and show me the path ahead. To at least answer my questions about which books I need to get, which dictionaries I need to get. And I have answered those questions for so many other people when I was helping out other people in Pali. And I would have done it in Cree and Ojibwe if I'd been able to stay in that field. And I'm still doing it in a sense in trying to play that positive role for Pali, for Theravada studies. So I say to him, because I am disappointed that he just hasn't shown any interest for several months, the indolence of people like yourself has long-term consequences for both scholarship in the abstract and for the lives of scholars in particular. When I was studying Pali, I worked hard as hell to help aspiring students. I reached out to, supported, and helped anyone with a shred of potential for the good of the future of this field of study. And only a small minority of those people really had a shot at contributing. I can say the same about a number of other rarely studied languages that I was involved with, even Cree and Ojibwe, etc., over the years. All of them I was involved with much more briefly than I would have chosen to be, but the choice was made for me by circumstances beyond my control. Obviously, I've been facing the very real decision as to whether or not I should be learning Dahong Dai in the past several months. You are one of extremely few people who could have at least discussed that decision with me, and who could have seriously influenced the short-term and long-term outcomes of this scenario. He's the only expert in this field who speaks English. He's a crucial figure for the future of this field. My prior work in both Pali and Laotian are huge advantages for learning Dai. The fact that I now live and work on a university campus where Dai is taught as a language formally in the classroom is a huge advantage. And yes, I now have good enough ability in Chinese. My ability to speak Chinese is good enough after an investment of a lot of time, money, and effort in that language. I was in a position to really take on this direction long term. And you couldn't be bothered to talk to me by email, let alone by telephone, etc. I think you are, to be blunt, the only white man I possibly could have talked to about this specialized field. And in all your life, really, do you think you'll ever talk to another English-speaking student who could have, in this scenario, made the leap to contributing to your field, to becoming a scholar in your field? Just pause. I could say the same to that professor of Sanskrit. How many years is he going to wait there at University of Victoria with an empty classroom? Literally an empty classroom. He had to cancel that class. He had to apologize to the supervisor of the department and cancel the class because he didn't have even one student. That's a failure. That's a black mark on his record. And it's a failure he's totally responsible for. It's totally his fault. He's not just destroying my future, he's destroying his own future in a very interesting sense. There are impacts on all sides here. When you fail to have the ambition to cultivate talent for the future of the field, to reach out to and positively support, aspiring scholars, aspiring researchers, however you want to put it, okay? It would not have cost you a dime just to care and just to provide advice to me when I crucially needed that advice. And I have done that for so many students of Pali, so I know exactly what it entails. End of the message. So look, guys, most of you watch this channel because you know about my engagement with vegan activism. There really is a sense in which this background I have in this type of scholarly endeavor is connected to how I approach vegan activism. From day one on this channel, the way I was reaching out to other channels positively, collaboratively, cooperatively. I said before, in education, you have to reach out to people positively, generously, supportively, trying to give them guidance and advice and the materials and tools they need to succeed, even when they don't have potential, even when they squander their potential, even when you've been disappointed a dozen times, helping one student after another, and each one just squanders the opportunity they've been given, that you meet the next student with an open heart and an open mind and the detachment and discipline to see them for what they are, to see them as a possible talent you can recruit or you can cultivate. In the same way, when we're talking about this political movement, when we're talking about the future of vegan activism, I tell you guys again and again, meet people with an open heart and an open mind. Get your heart broken. You'll be disappointed. You're going to try to cooperate with people. You're going to try to collaborate with people. You're going to be disappointed again and again. Keep having your heart broken until there's nothing left to break, and have the discipline to go back with an open heart and an open mind and be disappointed again. Because if you don't, you're destroying the future of the movement. You're destroying the future of the field of studies. And in a subtle way, you may not realize it, but you are actually undermining your own career. You're destroying your own potential by failing to promote the potential of others. Both in politics and in research, there's not much that one man can do alone. Even if it's just a group of 5, even if it's just a group of 10. Dictionaries are never written by one author, you at least need to build up a critical mass of like-minded intellectuals who can cooperate. 5, 10, 15, whatever it is. And the way you're going to do that, it's not going to be by meeting someone else who's already your equal. It's not going to be by meeting someone who's a ready-made colleague and contemporary of yours. You have to build the future of your own field of study. You have to build the future of this movement. You have to start with people who are, so to speak, raw materials, who have nothing but ambition, and show them the way for them to educate themselves, train themselves, to get the experience necessary for them to be your colleagues, be your contemporaries, for them to work for the future of the field of studies, for the future of the movement. On their own, with you in collaboration, however the case may be.